Are you autistic? Maybe you have an autistic person in your life, or maybe you're considering an adult diagnosis. Well, there's been some revisions and updates to the DSM-5, a diagnostic tool used by some countries across the world to diagnose autistic people. So let's have a look at what those changes and revisions are and what impact, if any, they have on autistic people and those seeking an autistic diagnosis. Hey, welcome back to my channel. And if this is the first time you've come to the channel and checked out a video, welcome to this community and thank you so much for taking the time to check out my YouTube channel. I'm Orionkelly, that autistic guy, and since my adult diagnosis, I've devoted my time to advocating for the autistic community. And I do that through my podcasts and these YouTube videos, with my goal in mind of raising the level of understanding, acceptance, and appreciation of the autistic community. And if that sounds like something you'd be interested in being a part of, please, I'd love it if you join my community. You can hit that subscribe button when you watch my videos. Don't forget to rate them, comment, and share them around so we can reach more people. And for those trying to read my t-shirt, written and directed by anxiety. Oh, and before we move on, you should check out my website, orionkelly.com.au. So let's start our whirlwind whistle-stop tour of the DSM-5. Yep. We've talked about the DSM-5 in a few videos on OCD and ADHD, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now what we're going to do is we're going to drill down into some very recent updates. Okay, so I'm talking 2022 revisions and updates to wording and to potentially some diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5, but we're going to stick specifically to autism, but also to some of the other peripheral diagnoses you can receive in addition to an autistic diagnosis. The DSM-5 refers to autism as Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD. I guess this isn't really a video for talking about that. It's probably better to call it a condition, autism spectrum condition, than disorder, but let's move on because that certainly is not a word they have revised or updated. It could have been. You could fit it in. It's a word. Anyway, let's have a look. So the American Psychiatric Association put out some fact sheets. And the one on ASD reads, in the upcoming text revision of the 5th edition of the DSM-5, the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is revised from the DSM-5 diagnosis. In addition to text changes throughout the disorder's description, which reflects updated literature and advances in knowledge, although they're still saying it's disorder. The most noticeable change is to the diagnostic criteria, specifically criterion A. Okay, so let's talk about the alteration to criterion A. All right, so here is the rationale for change to criterion A. The phrase, as manifested by the following, was revised to now read, as manifested by all of the following. Now, this is to improve the intent and clarity of the wording. The revision by the work group was consistent with the intent of the DSM-5 work group for autism spectrum disorder to maintain a high diagnostic threshold for requiring all of the following and not any of the following, as could be mistakenly inferred from the previous wording of the criteria. Here's what's kind of stupid about this. In its own text, it said, prior to the revision, it said, as manifested by the following. But then a few lines later, it says, so we're going to bring in the new version, as manifested by all of the following, because there was confusion with as manifested by any of the following. Yet, any of the following never appeared. What appeared was as manifested by the following. And they're saying there's some sort of mistake or confusion around diagnostic professionals reading as manifested by the following and then looking at the following and not realizing or not thinking that it should be all of those. So we have to put in as manifested by all of the following because we don't want people to think it's any of the following, even though it never said any of the following. It said as manifested by the following. This shouldn't cause any distress. This is It's no biggie, man. No biggie. This is not going to cause distress or issues for you. I promise. If you've been diagnosed, I guarantee you that healthcare professional absolutely did not. I know this is in a general sense, but broadly, healthcare professionals diagnosing ASD factored that in. They didn't think, oh, I'll just pick and choose. I'll just get a couple from the available and we'll go for it. No, they didn't. It was implied in their own training and knowledge and practice that it was in effect all of the following. What, to maintain a high diagnostic threshold? So what are you saying in that? You could read between the lines and say what they're trying to do is make the wording more black and white to decrease the rates of diagnosis. The issue there is autism is a spectrum. It's not a linear spectrum, so a line, right? It's a spectrum, an infinite color wheel. Not one autistic person is the same color on that wheel as another autistic person. So the idea that some could reach the cutoff, the threshold, and others couldn't, and then we can raise the bar again and potentially have less people receive a diagnosis they're entitled to because they were born with an autistic brain, just because there's a designated threshold they can't reach or they can't surpass, I think is devastating. Could be devastating to people looking for diagnosis, especially adults who have become so good at being neurotypical people in the real world. Of course, they crash and burn out, like me. But you've become so good, you could have appointments, you could have meetings, or you could have a diagnostic session or sessions and come across completely neurotypical. So yeah, I find this troubling, although I don't think people should be worried about it. Because like we said, okay, they can change the thing, but it used to be as manifested by the following, which I think implies, all the following, and it's been revised to as manifested by all of the following. Has that made it much harder? Probably not. But the idea that they think, the people behind the DSM-5 think they should maintain or strengthen a high diagnostic threshold for a neurological developmental condition, medically diagnosed as something that's the brain of a person, something of which we know very little of still, the brain, they can somehow work out how to manage that, to me, it's ridiculous. It's like, oh, hey, if you don't have it, you won't get diagnosed. So what's the problem? It's like, well, no, because people still don't grasp some degrees and some presentations, manifestations of autistic people. Now, given that autism is often diagnosed in younger people, in children, I think we'll touch quickly on some revisions or updates to the overall feel of DSM-5 regarding children. So let's have a quick look, and then we'll look at what they're trying to do, and we'll look at how they're doing it with regards to ASD. The DSM-5 5th edition text revision, like DSM-5, features a lifespan approach to mental health. The organisation of childhood conditions underscores how they can continue to manifest at various stages of life and may be impacted by the developmental continuum that influences many disorders. Some of the diagnostic criteria were updated in DSM-5 TR, text revision, to capture the experiences and symptoms of children more precisely. In addition, DSM-5 TR, like DSM-5, emphasised that, similar to any medical issue, no child should ever be diagnosed without a careful, comprehensive evaluation, and no medication should be prescribed without equal vigilance. Parents play an integral role in this process, as many of the DSM criteria require the symptoms be observed by them or other individuals who interact regularly with the child. So how is this being implemented into a diagnosis of ASD? Spoiler alert, not really anything. Existing criteria have been updated in DSM-5 TR to provide more precise descriptions and reflect the scientific advances and clinical experience of the last decade. Below are brief summaries of changes to selected disorders. We're just going to go with ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. Criterion A, hey, this sounds familiar, as manifested by the following, was revised to read as manifested by all of the following to improve its clarity. We replaced by the following with all of the following. And that's our way of ensuring that kids get the right diagnosis and aren't given diagnosis and medication and things when they're not required. Really? That's really? The revision by the work group was made to maintain a high diagnostic threshold by requiring all of the following and not any of the following, as could be mistakenly implied by the previous wording of the criterion. Of course, that wasn't the wording of the criterion. The previous wording implied any, but it just said by the following. By the following. You must tick off the following, and in by ticking off the following, there could be a diagnosis. I think the only people confused about this, honestly, are the DSM-5. And again, the whole threshold of diagnosis. What? If people are getting a better quality of life, mental health, and just overall quality of life through a diagnosis and through supports as a result of that diagnosis, why are we ever trying to raise this threshold? I get it. We don't want people being diagnosed with things they don't have. I get it. But that's very hard to do when the diagnosis is done properly prior to all this. And in addition to that, we still haven't reached the point where we can just go definitively autistic, not autistic, right? Because it's not something that's easily understood. The next revision I want to talk about, I think, is really strongly connected to the lives of autistic people. Maybe more so to autistic children, and maybe more specifically to autistic girls and women. And that is what's classed as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Now, if you have an autistic child or person in your life, you may say they're such fussy eaters. They don't want to eat the strangest things. I don't get why they don't want to eat that, but they'll eat this. And some days they do, and some days I don't understand it. Right? It's because this is, in my opinion, can be for some core experience as an autistic person. So that's why I think it's important to talk about this. The upcoming text revision of the DSM-5 TR includes revised diagnostic criteria of avoidant restrictive food intake disorder to provide more accuracy and clarity. Rationale for change. Criterion A was edited to eliminate the text as manifested by persistent failure to meet appropriate nutritional and/or energy needs. The edit was made to eliminate an inconsistency in the criteria in which criterion A contained the clause as manifested by persistent failure to meet appropriate nutritional and/or energy needs. But A.4 allowed criterion A to be met by marked interference with psychosocial functioning, which does not require a failure to meet nutritional needs. The updates in DSM-5 TR should help the clinical and research communities better implement the criteria in a more accurate and consistent manner. The next diagnosis from the DSM-5 that's been revised and updated I wanted to talk about was intellectual disability. I'm bringing this up because, number one, autism is not an intellectual disability. It's a neurodevelopmental disability. However, there are some autistic people who also have a co-occurring condition, which could be an intellectual disability. As a result, I think it's really important we talk about this, not only this topic, but what's changed. Okay, so in essence, the rationale for change is the term intellectual developmental disorder is being used to clarify the disorder's relationship with the WHO International Classification of Diseases 11th revision classification system, my goodness, which uses the term disorders of intellectual development. Okay, does that make sense? So we used to refer to it as intellectual disability. We are now referring to it as intellectual developmental disorder. And the equivalent term intellectual disability is placed in parentheses, that we say, for continued use. In other words, brackets. All right, so the DSM-5 TR includes in the diagnostic features section updated text that removes a phrase contained in DSM-5 that appears inadvertently to change the diagnostic criteria for intellectual disability to add a fourth criterion. Another change in the same section included revising the DSM-5 text to communicate the idea that although one should not be bound narrowly to the 65 to 75 IQ score range, the diagnosis would not be appropriate for those with substantially higher IQ scores. They're trying to clean this up. They're trying to make this more specific. Also talking about that 65 to 75 IQ score. You don't want to make that a hard and fast thing, but substantially higher IQ scores would deem an intellectual developmental disorder diagnosis inappropriate. Okay, so your child or the person in your life has the cognitive assessment or whatever goes with it, and their IQ score is higher than 65 to 75, but is it substantially higher? And that will make or break the difference between a potential diagnosis and supports or not. What's substantially higher? Now, this particular diagnosis in the DSM-5 that's been revised, updated, I think is really important to talk about because not only is mental health a big thing for autistic people, but also self-harm and self-injury are also very important. So let's talk about another diagnosis in the DSM-5 that I think is really relatable and really important and appropriate to talk about with regards to people being diagnosed as autistic with ASD. And that is the addition of diagnostic codes for suicidal behaviour and non-suicidal self-injury. In the upcoming 5th edition, DSM-5, text revision, diagnostic codes were added for suicidal behaviour and non-suicidal self-injury in Section 2 of DSM-5 TR, other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention chapter. To me, it's absolutely appropriate to talk about this. Suicidal behaviours and non-suicidal behaviours really are quite common within the autistic community. That's just factual. You can look at surveys and studies and whatever you want to do. It's just factual. So that's where I think it's really important to have a quick look at some of the changes to this particular diagnosis and the rationale around them. All right, so the rationale for change. The other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention chapter includes conditions, behaviours, and psychosocial or environmental problems that may be a focus of clinical attention or otherwise affect the diagnosis, course, prognosis, or treatment of an individual's mental disorder. The condition, behaviours, and problems listed in this chapter are not mental disorders. All right, so the inclusion of codes for suicidal behaviour and non-suicidal self-injury in DSM-5 TR is meant to draw attention to the scope of additional issues that may be encountered in routine clinical practice and to provide a useful, systematic listing to clinicians in documenting these issues. This addition will help improve documentation of these behaviours, which can serve to estimate risk factors for future suicide attempts or death. These codes can also help clinicians record suicidal behaviour and non-suicidal self-injury when occurring without mental health conditions. Finally, adding these codes will encourage research targeting their treatment specifically rather than simply addressing these behaviours as symptoms of an associated condition such as major depressive disorder. Again, you may have an autistic child or an autistic person in your life. You may be autistic. You may think you may be autistic. The idea that you may be prone to suicidal behaviour or self-harm, self-injury, non-suicidal self-harm or self-injury, which could be as a result of stimming, meltdowns, burnout. These things may well resonate and connect you to this particular diagnosis in the DSM-5 TR. And I think that's why it's important to talk about it. I just wanted to quickly go through some of those aspects of being an autistic person. It wasn't just the changes to ASD diagnosis, and have a quick look. In the end, the revisions and updates to the DSM-5 that related to autism and the diagnosis you may get in addition to or around the idea of autism diagnosis haven't really changed at all. There's been some tweaks, but it's not something that people should be worried about or concerned about or distressed about. But I think it's still important we talk about it, and I hope it's helped. I hope it's made sense. Share it with family and friends if you think they should see it. Thank you so much for watching my videos, and until my next one, I really do appreciate your support. We'll talk soon.